In the heavy afternoon heat, the funeral parlor breathed still air and wilted flowers. In the center, the closed coffin imposed a silence no one dared to break. On the caregiver's lap, a baby woke up with a sharp cry, raising its arms as if searching for the invisible. The German shepherd, until then withdrawn, stood up with its hair bristling and fixed its eyes on the wood. The cold hall witnessed the dry barks echoing against walls that trembled with the sound. The gravediggers, tense, exchanged glances and took a step forward. The coffin handle creaked, breaking the anticipation like cold metal. The slow screech of the lid lifting filled the space. And then, no one was breathing anymore. Love stories with animals. Then subscribe now and don't miss any. Thank you for following us. Now we return to our story. The heavy silence of the Hampton Estates grand parlor seemed to suffocate every breath. The stifling air of wilted flowers mixed with the distant creaking of chairs, being dragged by family members who dared not break the solemnity of the moment. At the center, an ornate mahogany chest sat with an imposing presence that didn't match the humble nature of what everyone believed it contained. The last will and testament of Patriarch William Thornbury, recently departed from their lives. There was a veiled discomfort in everyone's gazes, a tension that couldn't be explained in words, only in the way they all avoided getting too close to the ceremonial chest. Margaret, the housekeeper, who had always lived with the family in discreet silence, watched from the corner with twisted hands and a heavy heart, feeling something strange she couldn't name. It was at that moment that the baby's cry pierced the atmosphere like a blade, a sharp, unexpected sound that made heads turn suddenly. The child, until then asleep in the caregiver's arms, began to writhe, his fragile little arms shaking in the air as if perceiving something invisible. The crying didn't cease, becoming increasingly shrill, and his small open mouth seemed to carry more than hunger or discomfort. It seemed to carry a warning. The sound of crying reverberated against the cold walls, reaching everyone's ears like a call impossible to ignore. Victoria Thornbury, the eldest daughter and primary heir, stood near the antique fireplace with her characteristic poise, her auburn hair perfectly styled despite the emotional weight of the day. Her emerald eyes, usually sharp with business acumen, held a flicker of something deeper, worry perhaps, or guilt. She had built her reputation on Wall Street through calculated moves and an iron will. But today, in this room filled with family secrets, her composure felt more fragile than usual. Beside the large bay windows that overlooked the manicured gardens stood James Hartford, the family's longtime attorney and executor. His silver hair caught the afternoon light as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, reviewing documents that would change everything. James had been more than just the family lawyer. He had been William's confidant, the keeper of secrets that went back 3 decades. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he held the sealed envelope containing what he knew would be revelations that could tear this family apart. And then, Duke, the family's loyal German shepherd, suddenly rose from where he had been resting. His fur bristled, his gaze fixed on the mahogany chest, and from his throat echoed a hoarse, deep bark, loaded with fury and fear at the same time. He approached slowly, sniffing the air in front of the polished wood, and then barked louder, in repeated explosions that made the guests exchange nervous, embarrassed glances. The baby's caregiver, Maria Santos, had worked for the Thornbury family for over 5 years. Originally from El Paso, she had moved to New York, seeking better opportunities, and found herself caring for little Benjamin, Victoria's 6-month-old son. Maria's warm brown eyes now filled with concern as she tried to soothe the increasingly agitated infant, but nothing seemed to work. The child's cries grew more desperate, as if he sensed something adults couldn't perceive. Dr. Robert Thornbury, William's younger brother and the family's medical patriarch, stood near the ornate piano, his usually steady surgeon's hands now showing the slight tremor of age and stress. At 68, he had seen enough in operating rooms to recognize when something wasn't right, and today every instinct told him that this gathering held more than grief. His keen blue eyes, inherited from their father, scanned the room with clinical precision, noting every nervous gesture, every averted gaze. Victoria, with her haughty look, tried to reprimand Duke in vain. With each attempt, the animal responded with more intense growls, as if something within that chest challenged him. The contrast was striking. Here was a woman who commanded boardrooms and brokered million-dollar deals. Yet she couldn't control a family dog who seemed to know something she desperately wanted to keep hidden. Charles Whitmore, the family's business executive and Victoria's closest ally in managing the Thornbury empire, was a man of rigid posture and commanding presence. He rose and ordered that the dog be removed from there. His deep voice echoed like a sentence, but no one moved. The discomfort was visible. Charles had married into the family's inner circle through business partnerships and strategic alliances, making him both insider and outsider. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the tension in his jaw as he watched the scene unfold. The contrast between the innocence of the crying baby and the aggressiveness of the animal didn't go unnoticed, as if both, in their pure natures, perceived something the adults refused to see. Maria, with tears caught in her eyes, pressed the child against her chest, while Margaret whispered low prayers, fearing what she didn't know how to name. The estate workers, already impatient, looked at each other. Thomas McKenna, the head groundskeeper who had worked the property for over 20 years, was an older man accustomed to the strange ways of wealthy families. He crossed his arms and murmured that perhaps it was necessary to open the chest and proceed with the reading. The silence that followed his suggestion was almost physical, dense as a stone wall. Eleanor Thornbury Matthews, William's middle daughter, who had flown in from her home in Savannah, clutched her pearl necklace, a nervous habit she'd developed since her divorce. At 42, she had always lived in Victoria's shadow, content to manage the family's charitable foundations while her sister dominated the business world. But Eleanor knew secrets too, family whispers that had reached her southern mansion through late-night phone calls and hastily written letters. Victoria reacted immediately, raising her chin and declaring that opening the ceremonial chest before the appointed time would be an unforgivable disrespect. Charles supported her words, reminding everyone that there were protocols to follow, that nothing justified such an affront. But the restless looks multiplied, and the barking didn't cease, resonating like hammer blows against the forced calm. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the Persian rugs that had witnessed 3 generations of Thornbury family meetings. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with mechanical precision, each second building toward a moment that would change everything. Outside, the Long Island Sound sparkled in the distance, a peaceful contrast to the storm brewing within these walls. It was in this silent battle that the first turning point emerged. The baby, amid his crying, extended his little hand toward the chest, as if wanting to touch what lay beyond the wood. Maria tried to contain the gesture, but couldn't prevent everyone from seeing it. The simple gesture ignited a murmur among those present, and discomfort transformed into fear. Suddenly, one of the chest's ornate handles creaked as if it had yielded under invisible pressure. The metallic sound echoed through the parlor, chilling everyone's spine. Duke advanced, pawing at the ground as if demanding that the truth be revealed. The dog's instincts seemed to override years of training, his protective nature awakening to something that transcended normal understanding. Margaret had seen many things in her 30 years of service to the Thornbury family. She had cleaned up after their parties, kept their secrets, and maintained their reputation. Originally from County Cork in Ireland, she had immigrated to America with dreams of prosperity and found stability in service to one of New York's most prominent families. But today, her weathered hands shook as she dusted the same mantelpiece for the 3rd time, her keen intuition telling her that this day would be unlike any other. The insistence of the dog and the incessant crying of the child created unbearable pressure. Judge Harrison Blackwood, the family's longtime advisor and friend, always prudent, stood up and with a tired voice suggested that the only way to calm everyone would be to allow the scheduled reading to proceed ahead of time. Charles resisted, his authority challenged, but sweat could be seen on his forehead and the discreet tremor in his right hand. He knew that refusing would mean facing growing distrust and whispers. Victoria, even reluctant, began to realize that control was slipping away from her. The fear of exposure was as great as that of discovery. She had built her life on carefully constructed narratives, on versions of truth that served her purposes. But here, in this room filled with family history and genetic memory, those constructions felt as fragile as paper in the wind. The weight of expectation crushed the atmosphere as James Hartford's trembling fingers worked at the wax seal that had secured William Thornbury's final wishes for the past 3 months. Every eye in the room followed his movements with an intensity that made the air feel electric. The mahogany chest, passed down through 4 generations of Thornburys, had always been the repository of family secrets. But today it seemed to pulse with an energy all its own. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against her Hermes handbag, a rhythm that betrayed the anxiety she fought to conceal behind her boardroom mask. She had spent the morning in her father's study, poring over financial documents and corporate structures, preparing for what she believed would be a straightforward transfer of power. The Thornbury empire, built on shipping fortunes and later diversified into real estate and technology, was worth over $2 billion. She had assumed, as the eldest and most capable, that the mantle would fall naturally to her, but the baby's continued crying seemed to mock her assumptions. Little Benjamin, named after William's own father, had been unusually fussy all morning. Maria had tried everything, feeding, changing, even the soft lullabies her own grandmother had sung to her in Mexico before her family moved to Texas. Nothing worked. The child's distress seemed to intensify whenever they approached the ceremonial chest, as if his innocent spirit could sense the magnitude of what lay hidden within. Dr. Robert Thornbury moved closer to his great-nephew, his medical instincts overriding family protocol. He had delivered hundreds of babies during his early career as an obstetrician before specializing in cardiac surgery. Children, he had learned, possessed an intuitive sensitivity that adults often lost. Their nervous systems were more attuned to emotional energy, to the subtle vibrations of stress and deception that filled a room. Benjamin's reaction wasn't random. It was a response to something profound. Eleanor found herself thinking about her last conversation with her father, just 2 weeks before his sudden departure from their lives. They had sat on the veranda of her Savannah mansion, sipping mint juleps and watching the Spanish moss sway in the evening breeze. William had seemed different that night, more reflective than usual, speaking in riddles about legacies and the weight of truth. She had dismissed it as the philosophical musings of an aging patriarch. But now those words took on new meaning. Charles Whitmore's business acumen had made him indispensable to the Thornbury family over the past decade. Originally from Chicago, he had built his reputation managing hostile takeovers and complex mergers, earning a reputation as a corporate shark with an instinct for weakness. But his relationship with the family went beyond business. He had been William's protégé, the son the old man never had with Robert, who had chosen medicine over commerce. Charles had also been Victoria's lover, though their affair remained carefully hidden behind professional courtesy and strategic partnership. Duke's agitation reached a crescendo as James finally broke the seal. The German shepherd's training as a family guardian warred with instincts that screamed danger. He had been William's constant companion for the past 7 years, sleeping beside the old man's bed, accompanying him on his morning walks through the estate grounds. Dogs possessed an ability to read human emotion that transcended language, and Duke had spent months watching his master's growing anxiety, sensing secrets that weighed heavily on William's conscience. Margaret O'Sullivan had immigrated to America with nothing but fierce determination and an unshakable work ethic. The Thornbury family had given her stability, purpose, and eventually a deep emotional investment in their welfare. She had watched Victoria grow from a precocious child into a formidable businesswoman, had comforted Eleanor through her difficult divorce, and had maintained the household traditions that kept the family connected to their roots. But Margaret also knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. She had cleaned the offices after heated arguments, had served tea during clandestine meetings, and had seen documents that weren't meant for staff eyes. The first document James withdrew from the chest was not the will everyone expected, but a letter addressed to the entire family in William's careful handwriting. The paper was cream-colored, expensive, bearing the family crest, a ship's anchor intertwined with an oak tree, symbolizing both their maritime fortune and their deep Long Island roots. James cleared his throat, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in legal practice, but also the tremor of a man who understood that some words once spoken could never be taken back. "My beloved family," James began, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet. Even Duke seemed to listen, his barking reduced to low, anxious whines. "If you are reading this letter, then I have finally found the courage to reveal truths that I have carried alone for too many years. What you are about to learn will challenge everything you believe about our family, our fortune, and the foundations upon which you have built your lives." Victoria's face paled beneath her carefully applied makeup. She had built her identity on being William's chosen heir, his intellectual equal in business matters. The idea that her father had secrets, that there were aspects of the family history she didn't control, threatened the very core of her self-image. Her hand instinctively moved to her throat, where a diamond necklace caught the afternoon light, a gift from her father on her 30th birthday. When she had officially joined the company's board of directors, Charles leaned forward, his corporate instincts alert to potential threats. In his world, information was power, and the controlled release of sensitive data could make or break empires. He had assumed William's final wishes would be straightforward, a distribution of assets, perhaps some sentimental bequests, nothing that would threaten the carefully constructed power structure they had built together. But the old man's tone, even filtered through James's voice, carried warning. Eleanor's memory drifted to her childhood, to summer afternoons spent exploring the estate's hidden corners with Victoria and their younger brother Michael, who now lived in San Francisco, managing the family's West Coast interests. They had played games in the old servant tunnels that connected the main house to the carriage house, had imagined themselves pirates and princesses in equal measure. The estate had been their kingdom, and William their benevolent ruler. The thought that their father had harbored secrets during those idyllic years felt like a betrayal of innocence itself. The letter continued, James's voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. The Thornbury fortune was not built solely on the shipping business, as you have been told. There are complications to our family history that I chose to shield you from, believing that ignorance would protect you. I now realize that this protection has become a prison, and that the truth, however painful, is the only path to genuine freedom. Dr. Robert's hands stilled completely. As the family's medical professional, he had always prided himself on his diagnostic abilities, his capacity to see beyond surface symptoms to underlying causes. He had noticed changes in his brother over the past year, subtle signs of stress, sleepless nights evidenced by bags under William's eyes, a tendency toward isolation that was uncharacteristic for such a social patriarch. Robert had attributed these changes to aging, to the natural weight of responsibility that came with managing a business empire. Now he wondered what signs he had missed, what symptoms he had failed to properly diagnose. Maria felt Benjamin's crying begin to subside slightly, as if the child sensed that truth was finally emerging into light. In her experience caring for children, she had learned that infants often reflected the emotional state of their environment. Benjamin's distress had been a mirror for the family's hidden anxiety, his pure spirit responding to the deception that poisoned the very air they breathed. As James continued reading, the baby's protests transformed into the soft whimpers of exhaustion, as if a great burden was being lifted from his tiny shoulders. The estate itself seemed to respond to the revelation. The afternoon wind picked up outside, rattling the ancient windows and sending shadows dancing across the Persian rugs. The grandfather clock's ticking grew more pronounced, marking time as if counting down to a moment of no return. Even the flowers in their crystal vases seemed to droop further, their wilted petals falling silently to the polished tables like tears of acknowledgement. The decisions I made were motivated by love, by a desire to protect you from the complexities of adult choices made in desperate times. William's letter continued through James's careful pronunciation. But protection without understanding is merely another form of tyranny, and I will not carry these secrets to my grave. What you are about to discover will require forgiveness, not just for me, but for each other. As you navigate the consequences of truths I should have shared long ago. Victoria's business mind began calculating implications, running scenarios, assessing damage control options. Whatever William was about to reveal, it would require management, strategic planning, perhaps crisis communication with their various boards and shareholders. She had built her career on transforming problems into opportunities, on finding ways to turn potential disasters into competitive advantages. But this felt different, more personal, touching on foundations she had never questioned. The revelation was building slowly, deliberately, like a symphony reaching its crescendo. Each word James spoke seemed to unlock another door in the labyrinth of family secrets, and with each door opened, the path back to innocence grew more distant. The silence that followed James's pause was deafening. He had reached what appeared to be the end of the first page, and his hands shook visibly as he turned to the next section of William's letter. The afternoon shadows had lengthened across the parlor floor, creating a chessboard pattern of light and dark that seemed to mirror the moral complexity about to be unveiled. Duke had positioned himself directly in front of the mahogany chest, as if standing guard over secrets that were finally being released. His intelligent brown eyes moved from person to person, reading the tension in each face with the intuitive wisdom that had made German shepherds such loyal companions throughout history. The dog's breathing had settled into a watchful rhythm, but his muscles remained coiled, ready to spring into action if his protective instincts deemed it necessary. Margaret O'Sullivan found herself remembering the day she had first arrived at the Thornbury estate. It was 1993, and she had been a young woman of 25, fresh off the boat from Ireland, with recommendations from a domestic service agency in Manhattan. William had been in his prime then, a man of 42, with the kind of charismatic confidence that could fill a room. He had interviewed her personally, something she later learned was unusual for a man of his station, asking questions about her family, her dreams, her willingness to become part of something larger than herself. Over the years, Margaret had witnessed the family's evolution. She had seen William's first marriage dissolve under the pressure of building an empire, had watched him find love again with Catherine Morrison, a Broadway actress who had brought laughter and music into the solemn halls of the estate. Catherine had given William 3 children, Victoria, Eleanor, and Michael, before a sudden illness had claimed her life when the youngest was barely 12 years old. Margaret had helped raise those children, had been their confidant and protector during the dark years that followed their mother's passing. The original Thornbury shipping fortune, James continued, his voice now steady with professional resolve, was not built entirely through legitimate means. During the Prohibition era, my grandfather, Benjamin Thornbury, used our vessels to transport illegal alcohol from Canada to various ports along the eastern seaboard. This decision was made not from greed, but from desperation. The legitimate shipping business was failing, and Benjamin faced the choice between breaking the law or watching 4 generations of family legacy disappear. Victoria felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. The Thornbury name was synonymous with integrity in business circles. She had built her reputation on that foundation, had closed deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars based on the implicit trust that came with her family's sterling reputation. The revelation that their fortune had roots in criminal activity threatened not just her personal identity, but the carefully constructed brand that had taken decades to build. Charles Whitmore's mind immediately jumped to legal implications. Statute of limitations would protect them from any criminal liability, but the revelation could trigger investigations into their current business practices. Competitors who had lost bids to Thornbury Enterprises might file lawsuits claiming unfair advantage. Stock prices could plummet if the information became public. His fingers instinctively reached for his phone, mentally composing the calls he would need to make to their crisis management team. Eleanor's reaction was different, more emotional than strategic. She thought about her work with the family's charitable foundations, the hundreds of millions of dollars they had donated to causes ranging from education to environmental protection. Had all of their good works been built on blood money? Were the scholarships they provided to underprivileged children tainted by the illegal activities of their ancestors? The moral implications cut deeper than any financial concerns. Dr. Robert Thornbury's medical training had taught him to look for patterns, to trace symptoms back to their root causes. He began to understand William's recent behavior, the insomnia, the tendency toward brooding, the way his brother had begun asking questions about ethics and redemption during their weekly golf games. William had been preparing for this revelation, struggling with the weight of inherited guilt that had apparently been passed down through the generations like a genetic disorder. But the illegal shipping was only the beginning, James continued, and the room seemed to contract around his words. Benjamin Thornbury was not just a bootlegger. He was part of a larger network that included some of the most prominent families on the East Coast. Together, they created what amounted to a shadow economy, using legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activities. The connections made during this period became the foundation for legitimate business partnerships that persist to this day. Maria Santos held Benjamin closer to her chest, feeling the child's breathing synchronize with her own as he finally settled into peaceful sleep. In her traditional Mexican family, she had been raised to believe that secrets were like poison. They grew stronger in darkness and could only be neutralized by exposure to light. She had watched the Thornbury family struggle with unnamed tensions for years, had seen the way certain subjects were carefully avoided during family gatherings, had noticed how certain rooms in the house were kept locked and rarely entered. The revelation was beginning to make sense of patterns Maria had observed, but never fully understood. Why William kept certain business associates at arm's length despite their apparent success. Why certain family friends were never invited to intimate gatherings despite decades of public association. Why Victoria sometimes seemed to carry a weight that went beyond normal business pressures. The family had been living under the shadow of inherited secrets, and that shadow had shaped their relationships in ways they were only beginning to comprehend. Margaret found herself thinking about the locked room on the estate's third floor, a space that William had claimed contained only old furniture and documents of no importance. She had been instructed never to clean that room, never to enter it except in emergencies. Over the years, she had occasionally seen William emerge from that space looking troubled, sometimes carrying old photograph albums or documents that he would quickly return before anyone could see them clearly. Your great-grandfather Benjamin was not a criminal by nature. William's letter continued through James's careful narration. He was a desperate man making impossible choices during impossible times. But those choices created obligations, debts that extended far beyond money. The families who worked together during Prohibition formed bonds that transcended business. They became a kind of shadow aristocracy, with unwritten rules and mutual dependencies that influenced decisions for generations. The implications began to dawn on Victoria with the force of a physical blow. Her marriage to Jonathan Matthews, Eleanor's ex-husband, had not been the romantic union she had believed, but a strategic alliance between families with shared secrets. Her current business partnerships, the deals that had made her one of the most powerful women in American commerce, were not entirely the result of her own brilliance and determination. They were part of a larger web of historical connections that she had never fully understood. Charles realized that his own recruitment into the family's inner circle had not been based solely on his business acumen. His Chicago background, his connections to certain investment firms, his ability to navigate complex corporate structures, all of these qualifications took on new meaning in light of William's revelations. He had thought he was building his own empire in partnership with the Thornberrys, but now understood that he had been carefully chosen to fulfill a role in a much larger, more complex game. Judge Harrison Blackwood, who had remained silent throughout the reading, finally stirred in his chair. As a federal judge, he had sworn an oath to uphold the law, but as a family friend spanning 4 decades, he was bound by different obligations. Harrison had suspected that William's family history contained complications. No fortune built that quickly and that completely could be entirely clean. But he had chosen to focus on the Thornberry family's legitimate contributions to society, their philanthropy, their role as responsible corporate citizens in the modern era. The true burden of this inheritance, James read, his voice now carrying the weight of William's deepest confessions, is not the money or the property or even the business empire. It is the knowledge of how these things were obtained and the ongoing obligations to other families who share this history. There are debts, not financial but moral, that must be acknowledged. There are relationships that must be maintained, not from choice, but from necessity. Eleanor began to understand why her own marriage had failed. Jonathan Matthews had been chosen for her by William, not because of love or compatibility, but because of his family's historical connections to the Thornberry network. Her divorce had not been just a personal failure, but a disruption of carefully maintained alliances that had taken decades to establish. The guilt she had carried about her failed marriage now transformed into anger at the manipulation she had unknowingly endured. The estate itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of revelation. The grandfather clock's ticking had become hypnotic, marking time as if counting down to a moment of complete transformation. Outside, storm clouds had begun to gather over Long Island Sound, and the first rumbles of distant thunder provided a soundtrack to the emotional tempest brewing within the parlor walls. Duke raised his head suddenly, his ears perked toward a sound that only he could hear. The dog's supernatural sensitivity to emotional energy had made him the perfect guardian for a family carrying such heavy secrets. And now that those secrets were finally being released, his protective instincts were evolving, adapting to a new reality where truth, rather than concealment, would be the family's primary need. The atmosphere in the parlor had become suffocating, as if the very air was thick with decades of suppressed truth. James Hartford paused to wipe his glasses, a gesture that everyone recognized as his way of buying time when faced with particularly challenging legal territory. The next section of William's letter was clearly more personal, more damaging than what had come before. Victoria found herself studying the faces around her with new eyes. Charles, whom she had trusted with both business decisions and intimate secrets, now seemed like a stranger whose motivations she couldn't fully understand. Eleanor, her sister whom she had always seen as the weaker sibling, the one who chose emotional fulfillment over professional success, might have been carrying burdens that Victoria had never recognized. Even Margaret, the steady Irish woman who had been more mother than employee, appeared to possess knowledge that went far beyond household management. "There is something else," James continued, his voice dropping to nearly a whisper, "something that I have kept hidden even from your mother, Catherine, before she passed away. Something that affects not just our family's reputation, but the very foundation of who we are as Thornberrys." The baby Benjamin stirred in Maria's arms, Not crying now, but making soft cooing sounds, as if he were responding to the changing energy in the room. Maria had grown up in a family where women possessed what her grandmother called the sight, an ability to sense emotional currents that ran deeper than spoken words. She could feel something shifting in the room's atmosphere, something that made her want to protect the child from whatever revelation was coming next. Dr. Robert Thornberry moved closer to the window, ostensibly to check the approaching storm clouds, but actually to position himself where he could observe everyone's reactions. His medical training had taught him that people revealed their deepest truths not through words, but through involuntary physical responses, the dilation of pupils, the subtle changes in breathing patterns, the unconscious defensive postures that betrayed fear or guilt. Margaret O'Sullivan found her mind drifting to a conversation she had overheard 15 years ago, when she had been dusting the library late one evening and heard William arguing with someone on the telephone. The conversation had been heated, filled with references to obligations that couldn't be ignored and promises made by previous generations. She had never understood the context then, but now those mysterious words were beginning to form a pattern. In 1987, James read, his voice steady but his hands trembling, I discovered that my father, Thomas Thornberry, had not died in a sailing accident as I had been told throughout my childhood. He had been murdered by associates who believed he was planning to expose their illegal activities to federal authorities. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Victoria felt her carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Her grandfather, whom she had been taught to revere as a principled businessman who had died tragically young, had actually been killed for threatening to become a whistleblower. Everything she thought she knew about her family's history was not just incomplete, it was deliberately fabricated. Charles Whitmore's corporate instincts immediately began calculating the implications. A murdered family member could trigger federal investigations that had no statute of limitations. Cold cases could be reopened. Business relationships built over decades could crumble overnight if law enforcement began examining the historical connections between the Thornberry empire and other families with questionable past. Eleanor's charitable work suddenly took on new meaning. Had her dedication to helping others been subconscious compensation for her family's dark history? Had she inherited some genetic memory of guilt that drove her to give away millions of dollars in an attempt to balance moral scales she didn't even know existed? William learned the truth about his father's death through private investigators he hired after finding inconsistencies in the official story, James continued. But by then, he was already deeply embedded in the business relationships that his father had died trying to escape. The same associates who had killed Thomas Thornberry became William's business partners, his political allies, his children's godfathers. The revelation hit Dr. Robert like a diagnosis of terminal illness. He remembered the men who had been fixtures at family gatherings throughout his childhood. Successful businessmen, prominent politicians, society leaders who had treated the Thornberry children like beloved nephews and nieces. Some of those same men might have been responsible for his father's death, yet they had carved Thanksgiving turkeys at the family table, had given graduation gifts, had danced at his wedding. Duke's low growl filled the silence that followed James's words. The German shepherd's protective instincts were now fully engaged, his body language indicating that he sensed danger, not from any external threat, but from the toxic revelations poisoning the air around his beloved family. The dog's loyalty had always been absolute, but now it was being tested by information that challenged the very foundations of everything he had been trained to protect. Margaret found herself remembering specific individuals who had visited the estate over the years, men who had made her instinctively uncomfortable. Despite their polished manners and expensive suits, there had been something predatory about certain guests, something that made her want to keep the children away from them, despite William's insistence that they were family, friends. Her Irish intuition had been warning her for decades about dangers she couldn't articulate. Your grandfather, Thomas, was not the only victim, the letter continued, through James's increasingly strained voice. Over the past 37 years, 3 other individuals who threatened to expose the network's activities have died under suspicious circumstances. William believed that his continued silence was the only thing protecting his own children from similar fates. Victoria's mind reeled with the implications. Her father hadn't just inherited a business empire built on illegal foundations. He had inherited a position in what amounted to a criminal conspiracy that used violence to protect its interests. Every major decision William had made, every business deal he had negotiated, every marriage he had arranged, had been influenced by the need to maintain relationships with people who might kill him or his children if those relationships were severed. The storm outside had intensified, with rain now lashing against the tall windows and lightning illuminating the darkening sky. The estate seemed to be under siege from both natural forces and the revelation of unnatural secrets. Thunder rolled across Long Island Sound like the voice of judgment, punctuating William's confessions with divine commentary. Charles realized that his relationship with Victoria had been orchestrated from the beginning. His Chicago connections, which he had thought made him valuable to the Thornbury Empire, were actually links to the same shadow network that had controlled the family for generations. He hadn't been recruited for his business skills. He had been recruited because he was already part of the system, whether he knew it or not. The worst part, James read, his professional composure finally beginning to crack, was not the knowledge itself, but the way it changed every relationship, every decision, every moment of joy. I could never look at my children without wondering which of their friends, their business partners, their romantic interests had been chosen for them by forces beyond their understanding. I could never enjoy success without questioning whether it was earned or orchestrated. Eleanor began to understand why she had felt so disconnected from her own life, why even her happiest moments had been tinged with inexplicable sadness. Some part of her had always sensed that she was not living authentically, that she was playing a role in someone else's script without understanding the full plot. Her failed marriage, her difficulty forming lasting friendships, her tendency toward depression, all of these struggles now made sense as symptoms of inherited psychological trauma. Maria Santos felt Benjamin respond to the emotional turbulence around him by nestling closer to her warmth. In her cultural tradition, children were believed to be more sensitive to spiritual disturbances than adults, their souls not yet fully anchored to the physical world. Benjamin's earlier crying had been his innocent spirit's response to the lies and deceptions that poisoned the family's emotional atmosphere. Now, as truth began to emerge, the child was finding peace. The revelation was reaching its crescendo, but everyone in the room sensed that the most devastating secrets were yet to come. William's letter had been carefully structured to lead up to something even more shocking than murder and multi-generational criminal conspiracy. The man who had spent his final months preparing this confession had saved the most explosive revelation for last. Dr. Robert moved away from the window and positioned himself closer to his great-nephew Benjamin, his medical instincts telling him that the child might be their only source of untainted innocence once William's final secrets were revealed. In his experience as a surgeon, he had learned that sometimes the best way to save a patient was to cut away all the diseased tissue, no matter how much healthy tissue had to be sacrificed in the process. The Thornbury family was about to undergo the most radical surgery of their collective lives. James Hartford's hands trembled as he reached the final pages of William's letter. The weight of what he was about to reveal had been eating at him for 3 months, ever since William had entrusted him with this impossible burden. As the family's attorney, he had handled countless sensitive matters, but nothing had prepared him for the moral complexity of this moment. The storm outside had reached its peak, with lightning illuminating the parlor in stark, dramatic flashes that seemed to underscore the gravity of what was about to be revealed. Victoria had moved to stand behind her father's favorite armchair, gripping its leather back so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. She was a woman who had built her entire identity on control, on her ability to manage complex situations and turn them to her advantage. But this was different. This felt like watching her own life being rewritten by forces she had never known existed. "There is one final secret," James began, his voice barely above a whisper, one that William struggled with for over 2 decades. "Something that changes not just how we understand the past, but how we must navigate the future." Duke had positioned himself directly in front of the mahogany chest, his body language suggesting he was preparing to defend his family against an invisible threat. The German shepherd's intuitive understanding of human emotion had made him acutely aware that whatever was coming next would fundamentally alter the dynamics of the only pack he had ever known. Margaret O'Sullivan found herself holding her breath. In 30 years of service to the Thornbury family, she had seen them weather business crises, personal tragedies, and public scandals. But there was something about the quality of silence in the room that told her this revelation would be different from all the others. This would be the kind of truth that divided life into before and after. 24 years ago, James read, his voice growing stronger as he committed fully to the revelation. William discovered that his business partner and closest friend, Charles Whitmore Sr., had been working as an informant for federal investigators who were building cases against the shadow network that controlled so much of East Coast commerce. Charles Whitmore felt the blood drain from his face. His father, whom he had always believed died of a heart attack when Charles was in college, had been involved in law enforcement activities that Charles had never suspected. The man who had taught him about business ethics and the importance of legitimate success had apparently been living a double life, working to expose the very network that Charles now realized he had unknowingly joined. Charles Sr. had become disillusioned with the network's increasing use of violence to maintain control. The letter continued. He had witnessed the elimination of Thomas Thornbury and had decided that the cycle of murder and intimidation had to end. He began secretly documenting illegal activities, recording conversations, gathering evidence that could have destroyed dozens of prominent families across multiple states. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm raging outside. She was beginning to understand that her family's history was not just complicated by past crimes, but was actively being shaped by ongoing criminal conspiracies. The charitable foundations she managed, the society events she organized, the political candidates she supported, all of these activities now took on sinister new meanings as potential covers for money laundering or influence peddling. Dr. Robert Thornbury's medical mind was racing through implications and connections. He remembered Charles's father as a frequent guest at family gatherings, a man who had always seemed slightly uncomfortable with the ostentatious displays of wealth that characterized Thornbury's social events. Robert had attributed this discomfort to humble origins, never suspecting that it might have stemmed from moral conflict about the sources of that wealth. When William learned about his friend's cooperation with federal authorities, James continued, his voice now carrying the weight of ultimate betrayal, he faced an impossible choice. He could warn Charles Sr. and risk his own family's safety, or he could remain silent and allow events to unfold naturally. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in the room understood that they were about to learn whether William Thornbury had been complicit in the death of his best friend. The moral implications were staggering. If William had remained silent, then Charles Whitmore had built his entire career in partnership with the man who might have been responsible for his father's demise. Maria Santos felt Benjamin stir in her arms. Not with distress this time, but with what seemed like anticipation. The child's unusual sensitivity to emotional currents had made him a barometer for the family's psychological weather. And now his calm alertness suggested that the worst of the storm was about to pass, leaving clarity in its wake. William chose to warn Charles Sr., James revealed, his voice carrying both relief and new dread. But his warning came too late. Charles Sr. had already been discovered by network associates, and his elimination had already been planned. William's warning succeeded only in making him complicit in a cover-up that he had tried to prevent. Charles Whitmore staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. His father had died trying to do the right thing, and William had tried to save him. But the attempt to help had failed, leaving William trapped in a conspiracy he had never chosen to join. Charles's entire adult relationship with the Thornbury family now took on new meaning. He had been unconsciously seeking the father figure that William's generation had failed to protect. "But there is more," James continued, and the room seemed to contract around his words. Charles Sr.'s cooperation with federal investigators was not entirely voluntary. He had been approached by the FBI after they discovered irregularities in his son's college applications that had been sponsored by network families as part of their system of mutual obligations. Victoria's world tilted again. The network didn't just control business relationships and political connections. It managed the education and career development of the next generation. Charles's admission to Harvard, his early success in Chicago, his eventual recruitment into the Thornbury empire, none of it had been based on his individual merit. It had all been orchestrated by the same shadow system that had controlled her own life. Charles Whitmore Jr. was never supposed to know about his father's cooperation with federal authorities, the letter revealed. But William believed that Charles deserved to understand why his father had died, and why his own success had been carefully managed by forces he couldn't see. This letter is William's attempt to give Charles the choice that his father never had, the choice to remain ignorant or to understand the true nature of the world he inhabited. The revelation hit Charles like a series of physical blows. His Harvard education, his business success, his partnership with Victoria, even his romantic relationship with her, all of it had been managed by people who saw him as a chess piece in a game he had never known he was playing. His father had died trying to expose this system, and Charles had spent his entire adult life unknowingly perpetuating it. Eleanor began to understand why she had always felt like an outsider in her own life. Her marriage to Jonathan Matthews, her divorce, her subsequent difficulty forming lasting relationships, all of these experiences had been shaped by network interference. She had been trying to live authentically while surrounded by people whose every action was calculated to serve larger purposes she couldn't comprehend. The network's control extends far beyond business and politics, James read, his voice now carrying the full weight of William's final confession. It manages marriages, educations, career paths, even friendships. The goal is not just wealth or power, but the preservation of a system that has survived for nearly a century by ensuring that each generation remains dependent on relationships they don't fully understand. Margaret O'Sullivan realized that her own hiring had not been coincidental. Her immigration from Ireland, her placement with the Thornbury family, her gradual integration into their inner circle, all of it had been managed by people who recognized that she would become a repository for family secrets. She had been chosen not just for her domestic skills, but for her capacity to remain loyal even when loyalty required keeping silent about things that violated her moral code. William's greatest regret, the letter concluded, was not the crimes of previous generations, but his failure to break free from a system that had already claimed too many victims. He spent the last 5 years of his life trying to find a way to expose the network without destroying the people he loved. This letter is his final attempt to give his children what he never had, the knowledge necessary to make truly free choices. The room fell silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the grandfather clock marking time with mechanical precision. Everyone present understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The comfortable illusions that had structured their lives had been stripped away, leaving them naked before the complexity of moral choices they had never imagined they would have to make. Duke's low whine broke the silence, a sound that seemed to express the collective anguish of a family confronting the gap between who they thought they were and who they actually were. The German shepherd moved closer to Benjamin, as if recognizing that the child represented their only hope for a future untainted by the sins of previous generations. Benjamin himself had fallen into the deep, peaceful sleep that comes after great emotional release. The child who had been so distressed by the family's hidden secrets now rested calmly, as if his innocent spirit recognized that truth, however painful, was preferable to the poison of sustained deception. In his small, perfect face, the family could see a reflection of who they might become if they found the courage to choose differently than their ancestors had chosen. The silence that followed William's final revelation stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Lightning continued to flash outside, but the thunder was growing more distant, suggesting that the worst of the storm was passing. Inside the parlor, a different kind of storm was just beginning, the psychological tempest that comes when people must rebuild their understanding of themselves and their world from the ground up. Victoria was the first to speak, her voice hoarse with emotion, but still carrying the authority that had made her one of America's most powerful businesswomen. "We have a choice," she said, looking around the room at faces that now seemed both familiar and foreign. "We can let this destroy us, or we can use it to become who we should have been all along." Charles Whitmore sat heavily in the nearest chair, his head in his hands. The revelation about his father had shattered every assumption he had made about his own life and career. But as the initial shock began to fade, he found himself thinking about the man who had raised him, a father who had tried to do the right thing even when it cost him everything. "My father died trying to break free from this system," he said quietly. "Maybe that's the real inheritance he left me." Dr. Robert Thornbury moved to check on Benjamin, his medical instincts providing him with a concrete way to process the emotional chaos around him. The child was sleeping peacefully now, his tiny chest rising and falling with the rhythm of innocence. "This baby doesn't carry any of our guilt," Robert observed. "He's starting with a clean slate. Maybe that's what we all need to do." Eleanor found herself thinking about her charitable work with new understanding. "I've spent years trying to give back to communities without ever knowing what I was giving back for," she said. "Now I know, and now I can choose to do it consciously, as restitution rather than just charity." Margaret O'Sullivan stepped forward, her Irish accent more pronounced than usual due to stress. "I've kept this family's secrets for 30 years, she said. "But secrets that protect criminals aren't the same as secrets that protect children. If we're going to change, we need to decide what's worth protecting and what needs to be exposed." James Hartford carefully folded William's letter and placed it back in the mahogany chest. "From a legal perspective," he said, "we have options. The statute of limitations protects us from prosecution for past crimes, but it doesn't protect us from ongoing criminal activities. If we want to break free from this network, we need to do it carefully, systematically." Victoria looked around the room, her mind already working on the practical aspects of transformation. "We have resources," she said. "We have money, connections, expertise. We can use those advantages to expose the system from the inside. But it will require all of us to be willing to sacrifice everything we've built." Charles raised his head, his eyes red with unshed tears, but burning with new determination. "What we've built was never really ours anyway," he said. "Maybe it's time to find out who we really are when we're not being managed by puppet masters." Duke had settled beside Benjamin's sleeping form, the German shepherd's protective instincts now clearly focused on guarding the family's future rather than its past. The dog's calm presence seemed to anchor everyone else's emotions, providing a steady point of reference in the midst of psychological chaos. "There will be consequences," Dr. Robert warned. "People who have built their lives on this network won't let us walk away without a fight. We need to be prepared for retaliation, both legal and financial." Eleanor nodded, her years of managing charitable foundations having taught her about the complexities of institutional change. "We'll need allies," she said. "People outside the network who can provide support and protection while we figure out how to disentangle ourselves." Maria Santos spoke for the first time since the revelations began. "In my family," she said softly, "we have a saying, la verdad no teme la luz. The truth doesn't fear the light. Sometimes the only way to heal sickness is to expose it to air and sunshine." Margaret smiled at the young woman's wisdom. "As children know when something's wrong," she added. "That's why little Benjamin was so upset. He could feel the poison in the air. Now that the truth is out, he can sleep peacefully." James looked around the room, his legal mind already working on the practical steps they would need to take. "We'll need to establish new corporate structures," he said. "Create legitimate businesses that can operate independently of network influence. It will take time, and it will be expensive, but it's possible." Victoria stood and walked to the window, looking out at the clearing storm. The rain had stopped, and patches of blue sky were visible between the dissipating clouds. "My father spent 40 years trapped by choices made by previous generations," she said. "But he also spent his last 5 years trying to give us the information we needed to make different choices. That's his real legacy, not the money or the businesses, but the opportunity to choose freedom over security." Charles joined her at the window, looking out at the same landscape, but seeing it with completely different eyes. "I built my career thinking I was competing on merit," he said. "Now I know I was just playing a role in someone else's script, but scripts can be rewritten." Eleanor was already making mental lists of the charitable organizations she would need to contact, the investigations she would need to fund, the legal challenges she would need to support. "We have enough money to hire the best investigators, the best lawyers, the best protection," she said. "We can turn our resources into weapons against the system that created them." Dr. Robert checked his watch and realized that hours had passed since they had begun reading William's letter. The afternoon was fading into evening, but instead of feeling exhausted by the emotional marathon they had endured, everyone in the room seemed energized by the prospect of finally living authentically. "There's something else in the chest," James announced, reaching for a second envelope that bore William's handwriting. Instructions for accessing offshore accounts that he set aside specifically to fund our escape from the network. "He's been planning this revelation for years." Duke's tail wagged for the first time since the revelations began, as if the dog sensed that the family's emotional weather was finally clearing. The German Shepherd's intuitive understanding of human emotion had made him a perfect barometer for the psychological changes occurring around him. Benjamin stirred in Maria's arms, opening his bright eyes and looking around the room with the curious intelligence that would someday help him understand the extraordinary gift his great-grandfather had given him, the gift of truth, and the opportunity to build a life based on conscious choices rather than inherited obligations. As the evening settled over the Hampton estate, the Thornbury family began to plan their exodus from a shadow world they had never chosen to enter. It would be dangerous, expensive, and potentially devastating to everything they had built. But for the first time in generations, they would be living as themselves rather than as characters in someone else's story. The storm outside had passed, leaving the air clean and fresh with the scent of rain and new possibilities. Inside the parlor, a family was being reborn, choosing truth over comfort, freedom over security, and hope over fear. William's final gift to his children had been the most precious inheritance of all, the knowledge necessary to break free from the sins of their fathers and create something genuinely new. Margaret looked around the room at faces that seemed younger somehow, as if the burden of carrying inherited secrets had aged them prematurely. "It's a new beginning," she said simply. "Scary as hell, but new." Victoria smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Benjamin will grow up knowing the truth," she said. "He'll never have to discover that his whole life was built on lies. That alone makes all of this worth it." The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its sound no longer ominous but hopeful, marking time toward a future that would be shaped by conscious choices rather than unconscious inheritance. The Thornbury family was about to embark on the most dangerous and important journey of their lives, the journey toward authenticity. Dear listeners, we hope the story of the Thornbury family and their journey from inherited secrets to chosen truth has moved you as deeply as it has moved us. Sometimes the most powerful prison is the one we don't even know we're in, and the most courageous act is choosing freedom, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. In a world where family legacies can become burdens rather than gifts, the Thornberrys' decision to break free from their shadow network reminds us that it's never too late to choose authenticity over comfort. For more stories that explore the complex bonds of family, loyalty, and the courage to change, please subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. We bring you unique tales every day that delve into the hidden depths of human relationships and the price of living truthfully. Don't miss our upcoming content, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What would you do if you discovered your entire life had been shaped by forces you never knew existed? Join the conversation and let us know.